Good morning, buenos dias, bonjour, sin chao, ni hao, what's up? It's me, Mr. Jordan. Today we're going to be looking at chapter 10 of The Handmaid's Tale. We'll start with a brief recap summary of the chapter. Our narrator, Offred, starts by singing Amazing Grace and then a pop song, or kind of romantic ballad, then thinks about how Rita in the kitchen hums, and Serena Joy as well sings with her faded voice. So you have this image of a house with three women singing in it. She has a flashback to her times with her friend Moira, her old best friend from college, and the good times that they were having together when they were free, even though there were still negative and violent reports in the news media at the time. In the third section of the chapter, the narrator watches out of her bedroom window as Nick and the commander drive away from the household, so they leave all the women behind because the men still have freedom of movement. Starting to dig into the analysis and close reading of chapter 10. All three of these women singing in the house. So you have Amazing Grace, obviously an American song. It was sung originally, I believe, by a reformed slave trader from the American South, but certainly there's associations here of the end of slavery and slaves being freed. And then you also have this pop song of longing and desire, so returning to the theme of yearning. And then we're told that Rita hums and Serena sings. So what I think's happening here is this sort of allusion to like a Maya Angelou type caged bird singing. The women who are left behind in the house when the men go out freely to move about and do as they please in Gilead all sing to themselves like caged birds. In a flashback, we hear from Aunt Lydia. So she was one of the characters who was re-educating women in the Red Center, or the Leah and Rachel Center. And this was sort of the inculcation of Gilead's new rules, right? So Lydia is a reference to the convert, the first convert in Europe, and the idea that she was then sort of an evangelist, spreading the gospel, spreading the new word. So Aunt Lydia is spreading the new word of Gilead to Offred and the other handmaidens. She talks about how women used to make spectacles of themselves, how they were like roast meat on a spit. So again, this image of livestock, of women's bodies being used in industrial production and meat by the society. Then we hear some victim blaming. So Lydia goes on to say, oh, no wonder things used to happen to women. No wonder they were bringing it upon themselves, right? This is a classic instance of victim blaming. But there's also irony at work here, because alongside this, Atwood is telling us things are still happening to women, right? It's not like the world in any way, shape, or form has improved under the new Gilead society and its new social structure or organization. It's still terrible to be a woman, right? If anything, it's worse, right? We know from our narrator that she's more oppressed or feels more oppressed and repressed and held back than she did in America. Interestingly, there's a moment where Lydia sort of slips out of character. She has her own memory of lovers in a park together and then compares a woman's body to an apple or a wrinkled apple. So I think there's this allusion here to Genesis and the biting to the apple, the original loss of innocence. But also, we're told by the narrator that you're not supposed to refer to this anymore, this idea that beauty can be withered or age with time. As we've already seen Serena Joy, right? She's aged with time and is now the commander's wife, who no longer can respect or call attention through her looks and vanity, the way she once was on television. And there's a moment of tenderness here, right? We sympathize for a moment with Aunt Lydia when she tells us, I'm doing my best. So we realize she too is a part of the system, right? She's become a cog in the functioning of Gilead's male chauvinist society. There's a nice little bit in this chapter about Offred explaining when she was normal in America, how her cat would come up to the back door and leave her mice, right? And I think what's getting at here is this idea that the mice are sort of offering, the same way of Fred, Offred is offered, right? All this wordplay, it builds up like a palimpsest, right? Atwood is so intent on eking out and pressing out every possible meaning from each word and sound. The flashback to Moira here, the best friend, I think is a real example of the binary between freedom and captivity. When our narrator is stuck in her room, completely imprisoned, Moira sort of strolls or breezes into her dreams like this, wavy, ethereal, hippie, light on her toes being, almost like a Holly Golightly kind of thing. She's a drifting thing, right? She's weightless. She's not tethered down. She's evanescent, light as a fairy. But immediately Atwood pulls us back in, and off-red tells us, we lived as usual by ignoring. Ignoring isn't the same as ignorance. You have to work at it. So she's telling us that you have to be active to ignore. If you're ignorant, you just don't know something. If you're ignoring, you're now capable. You're culpable. So this is the conscious choice to turn away from the bad news. There's violence, there's bodies piling up in the press. But she and Moira chose not to look. They're averting their eyes, as earlier we had in the vocabulary, avert. So they're starting to avert from the horror, from the bad dreams, the nightmares, the flashbacks. Awful without being believable is how she describes the news. So they ignored this overarching history of violence by staying in the margins, by hiding out of the spotlight. We lived in the white spaces, at the edges of print, in the gaps between stories. Vocabulary. Lugubrious. Lugubrious, looking or sounding sad. Lugubrious is actually a reference to Latin. In lugere in Latin means to mourn. So she's saying she's looking mournful or she's in mourning. So Atwood uses this word sects, S-E-C-T-S, as in different groups of Christians or beliefs that vary slightly from the established church. And then there's an obvious oral play on words here where she's talking about sex, S-E-X. Unfathomable means literally you can't imagine the depths, or you're incapable of understanding the profundity, the depth of something. It's like impossible to measure. So before the world was mapped or the ocean's depths were known, the fathoms of the ocean were unfathomable. So complexion is the natural color, texture, look of someone's skin. It's also the general aspect or character of a thing. I think it's her understanding this idea of combination of what makes a thing a thing. What is the thing's thingness, itself, its complexion.